Of. The morning they loaded her onto the supply wagon, Hazel Dunmore was worth exactly $112 and a forgiven note on a failing grain lease. She knew the number because she had found the paper herself. It was folded into her father's coat pocket, the one he'd left draped over the back of the kitchen chair the night before, still smelling of pipe tobacco and the particular kind of shame that has no language for itself. She hadn't meant to read it. She had meant to check if he'd remembered his gloves. But the figure was written in clean, deliberate ink at the bottom of the page, and below it, 2 signatures. Her father's cramped scrawl, and beneath that, a name she didn't recognize, Leland Mast. She put the paper back exactly as she'd found it. She went to her room and sat on the edge of her bed in the dark for a long time, listening to the wind drag dead leaves across the yard outside Millhaven, Kansas. She was 22 years old. In the morning, her father told her she was going north. He said it the way a man announces weather, looking at the window frame instead of her face. There was a man up in the Flint Hills who needed a housekeeper, he said. Someone to keep the place running. The family had recently suffered a loss. There were children, 3 of them. Hazel asked him once if she had a choice. He didn't answer. He just walked to the stove and poured himself coffee. She packed a single trunk. Wool dress, an extra pair of boots, a hairbrush her mother had left her, and a small Bible she had never once opened but couldn't bring herself to leave behind. She didn't cry. Crying was for women who believed the world intended to treat them fairly. And Hazel had stopped believing that somewhere around the age of 14, when her mother died of a burst appendix on a Wednesday afternoon, and the county couldn't send the doctor until Thursday. The wagon that came for her was driven by a hired hand named Otto, who smelled of dried sweat and barely spoke a word for the entire 3-hour ride north. Hazel sat in the back on her trunk and watched Millhaven disappear into the flat brown horizon. Nobody came out to watch her go. Not that she'd expected them to. The property belonging to Leland Mast sat at the end of a long dirt track that cut through a stretch of tall grass prairie so wide and so empty it made Hazel's ribs feel tight. The grass was the color of old hay, bent sideways in the October wind. The sky above it was an enormous, indifferent gray. She had always thought the plains were lonely. She had never understood before that they could be threatening. The farmhouse was a 2-story structure of unpainted wood that had weathered to a deep silver gray. It was solid enough. The porch boards were warped, and one of the upstairs shutters had come off its hinges and was leaning at an angle against the clapboard siding. Smoke came from the chimney. That was something. Otto pulled the wagon to a stop and unloaded her trunk into the dirt without comment. He was back on the seat and turning the horses around before Hazel had even straightened her skirts. She picked up her trunk by the handle and dragged it toward the porch steps. The front door opened before she reached it. Leland Mast was not what she'd expected. She wasn't sure what she'd expected exactly. Something worse. He was lean and weathered, somewhere in his mid-30s, with the narrow, deliberate movements of a man who had spent years working in wind. His hair was dark and cut short, and he had the kind of jaw that looked like it had been set in anger so many times it had simply stayed that way. He wore a collarless shirt with the sleeves rolled past the elbows despite the cold, and he looked at her the way a man looks at a fence post he's not sure will hold the wire. He said nothing for a moment, then, "You're Dunmore's girl." "I'm Hazel," she said. Dunmore's girl implies he had some claim to me worth mentioning. He blinked once. If it surprised him, he didn't show it. He pushed the door open wider and stepped back. "Kids are inside. Supper's your problem starting tonight." She pulled her trunk through the door. The house smelled of unwashed laundry, scorched milk, and 3 months of grief that nobody had bothered to open a window for. The children were arranged in the kitchen like a tribunal. The oldest was a girl of about 10, standing with her arms crossed and her chin raised, wearing a dress that was 2 sizes too large and had belonged to someone else. Beside her, a boy of 7 sat on the edge of the table with his legs swinging, watching Hazel with frank, unblinking curiosity. On the floor near the stove, a girl of 4 was building a small pile of dried beans she had apparently taken directly from the storage crock, stacking them with extreme concentration. The older girl spoke first. "You're not from around here." "No," Hazel said. "Our last housekeeper was from Salina." She lasted 11 days. Good for her, Hazel said, and set her trunk down against the wall. The girl's chin stayed up. Her name, Hazel would learn, was Rosette. The boy was called Ned. The youngest was Bertie, who communicated primarily through a private language of squeaks and ferocious determination. Their mother, a woman named Eleanor, had died of a fever in late July. Leland had kept the farm running by working from before dawn until after dark, and the children had been left largely to themselves in the hours between, which had been neither good for them nor for the house. The kitchen had not been properly cleaned since summer. There was a dark ring scorched into the top of the stove where someone had left a pot to boil dry. The floor had not been swept in what appeared to be weeks. The curtains were stiff with grease. Hazel took off her coat. She hung it on the peg by the door. "All right," she said. "Who knows where the broom is?" Nobody moved. "Rosette." The girl's eyes narrowed. "How do you know my name?" "Your father told me on the way in. Where's the broom?" A pause. Then, with the elaborate reluctance of someone doing you the greatest possible favor, Rosette pointed toward the pantry door. That was the beginning. The first week was a kind of warfare conducted entirely in silence and inconvenience. Rosette did not break things or yell. She simply made everything slightly harder. The flour was not where Hazel had put it. The kindling was not stacked the way she'd left it. Once, Hazel came into the kitchen to find that someone had rearranged every pot and pan onto the wrong hooks. And when she looked at Rosette, the girl was sitting at the table reading a primer with the expression of a person who had been reading that primer all morning and had certainly not been in the kitchen at all. Ned was easier in the way that a dog that bites is easier than a cat that schemes. He'd taken one look at Hazel, decided she was temporary, and was simply waiting her out. He stole the last of the dried apple slices from the pantry shelf and blamed it on a mouse. When she caught him, with sugar on his chin, and cornered him about it, he looked her dead in the eye and said, "I don't remember." Bertie was a different matter entirely. Bertie followed Hazel like a shadow for the first 3 days, without speaking a single word to her, appearing silently at her elbow while she was kneading bread or banking the fire, just watching with enormous brown eyes. On the 4th morning, Hazel turned from the stove and found the child standing directly behind her, holding up a small piece of red ribbon. Hazel looked at the ribbon. She looked at Bertie. "Is that for me?" she asked. Bertie stared at her. Hazel crouched down. She held out her hand. The child placed the ribbon in her palm with grave ceremony, and then went and sat back down on the floor and returned to her beans. It was the strangest and most formal gift Hazel had ever received. Leland was almost never in the house during daylight hours. He was up before the sun and out managing the farm, the wheat stubble, the livestock, the fence lines that the late summer storms had knocked around. He came inside at noon, ate whatever was on the table without comment, and went back out. He came in at dusk, ate again, and went upstairs. He said perhaps 12 words to Hazel in the first week, none of them unnecessary. She told herself this was fine. She didn't need conversation. She needed to keep the fire going, and the children fed, and her own mind from eating itself alive at night, when the wind made the house creak like a ship in a bad swell, and she lay on the narrow cot in the back room, staring at the ceiling and thinking about the number $112. The crisis came in the 3rd week. It came in the form of a rooster. Leland had a rooster he'd apparently been tolerating for 2 years past the point of usefulness, a big ugly bird named Colonel by the children that had at some point become completely feral in temperament. It had already driven off 2 different hens through sheer aggressive personality, and on a Tuesday morning in early November, it came at Hazel from around the corner of the barn while she was carrying water from the pump. She didn't drop the buckets. She stepped back, slipped on a patch of frozen mud, and went down hard on one knee. The water went everywhere. Her skirt soaked through immediately. The rooster stood 3 feet away, jerking its horrible head at her. She sat in the mud for a moment. Her knee throbbed. The water was already freezing to the ground around her. She was cold and wet, and her hands were bleeding from grabbing at the ground, and she was at that specific moment furious, in a way that had nothing to do with the bird, and everything to do with the fact that she had been sold to a quiet man in the Flint Hills for the price of a grain note, and was now sitting in frozen mud being stared at by a rooster. She picked up one of the empty buckets. She hurled it at the colonel. She missed. She went back to the pump and filled the buckets again. She carried them to the kitchen. She set them on the counter. She turned around. Rosette was standing in the doorway watching her. "Colonel got you," the girl said. Her voice was perfectly neutral. "Colonel," Hazel said, "is going to become the worst problem I have ever encountered, or he is going to become Sunday soup. One of those things will happen before this month is out." Rosette looked at her for a moment. Something shifted in the girl's face. It was not warmth exactly. It was more like reluctant reassessment. She said, "He got the last housekeeper twice." "Good for the last housekeeper," Hazel said. "She had more sense than to stay." Rosette almost smiled. She didn't, quite, but it was close. That was the crack in the wall. It didn't come all the way down. Rosette still moved the flour, but twice in the following week she helped without being asked. Once carrying wood in from the porch when she saw Hazel's arms were full, once standing at the stove stirring the porridge when Hazel had gone out to deal with a problem in the yard. She didn't acknowledge either thing. Hazel didn't thank her. They had a kind of arrangement. She and this 10-year-old girl conducted entirely without words. Ned figured it out a few days later and decided if his sister wasn't fighting her anymore, he probably didn't have a good reason to either. He started doing the task Hazel set him in the mornings with only about half the objection he'd been putting in before. That was, for Ned, practically cooperation. Bertie began sitting in the kitchen while Hazel cooked, not helping, just sitting, building her piles of beans or lining up spoons or doing whatever private project occupied her enormous internal world. Occasionally, she would look up and hand Hazel something, a wooden spoon, a cloth, once a single dried corn kernel, for no discernible reason, with the same solemnity she'd given the ribbon. Hazel accepted each offering with equal gravity. The harder problem was Leland. Not because he was cruel, he wasn't. He fed the children. He kept the roof from leaking. He worked himself to the edge of exhaustion every single day, on a farm that was just barely holding together. But he moved through the house like a man who had decided not to be present in it anymore. He was there in body. He ate the food. He tracked mud in from the fields. He occasionally said things like "lamps low" or "back gates come off the latch." But the person who had lived in that house, the one who had laughed and built something with Eleanor, had left with her in July, and nobody had told Hazel where it went. She was careful with him. She made his food and kept out of his way. She did not ask him questions. She did not try to soften things or make the evenings companionable. She was not there to fix his grief. She was there because her father had needed $112 and a cleared note, and the least she could do in exchange for that humiliation was be useful. But one night in mid-November, she was awake past midnight when she heard it. It came from the kitchen. She thought at first it was Bertie, who sometimes got up in the night. But when she came down the hall in her stockings, she found Leland sitting at the kitchen table in the dark. Not crying, not doing anything, just sitting with both hands flat on the table and his head bowed between them like a man in a church that had run out of things to pray to. Hazel stood in the doorway. She considered going back to her room. She nearly did. Instead, she crossed to the stove, stoked the bank coals into something useful, and put the kettle on. She didn't say anything. He didn't look up. She made 2 cups of coffee from the last of the good grounds and set one on the table in front of him. She sat down across from him with her own cup and waited. He lifted his head eventually. He looked at her across the dark table. His face, in the low orange light of the stove, looked like a map of something that had been through a hard season. "She used to make coffee that could strip paint," he said. His voice was rough and strange, like he hadn't used it in a long time. "I could never figure out how she got it that strong." "Too much heat too long," Hazel said. "Burns the grounds, I know. I watched her do it every morning for 11 years. He wrapped both hands around the cup. "Still can't figure out how I let the fire get this low." She understood he wasn't talking about coffee anymore. She didn't say anything. She just drank her own coffee and let the stove tick and settle in the quiet, and after a while his shoulders came down from around his ears, and he breathed out a long, slow breath that seemed to have been sitting in his chest for a very long time. He didn't say anything else, neither did she. After 20 minutes he stood up, took the cup to the counter, and went back upstairs. But in the morning he said, "Good coffee," when he came down, and it was the first voluntary thing he had said to her that wasn't instructions about the farm. She considered that a beginning. The real test arrived in December, the way the worst things always did, without warning, in the middle of the night, while everyone was already exhausted. Ned started running a fever on a Monday. By Tuesday it had climbed into something serious. His breathing turned shallow and rapid, and by Tuesday evening, when Hazel pressed her palm to his forehead, the heat of it shocked her hand. He was burning from the inside. She'd seen fever take people before. She knew what bad looked like. Leland was 3 hours away at a livestock auction in a town called Greer. He'd left before dawn. There was no way to reach him. Rosette stood in the doorway of Ned's room. She was wearing her nightgown with a blanket pulled around her shoulders. Her face was completely white. "He had this in spring," she said very quietly. "He almost didn't." She stopped. Hazel looked at her. The girl's jaw was working, fighting to hold it together. "Get Bertie," Hazel said. "Bring her downstairs and keep her by the stove. I need you to keep the fire going, and I need you to bring me water when I ask for it." "Can you do that?" Rosette nodded. She disappeared down the hall. What followed was the longest 2 days of Hazel's life. She didn't sleep. She rotated between the pump and the stove and Ned's bedside, pressing cool cloths to his head, making him sip broth when he was lucid enough to swallow, packing him in cool sheets when the fever spiked, and warming bricks wrapped in flannel when the chills rolled through him. She sent Rosette to the nearest neighbor, a farm 3/4 of a mile east, to see if anyone had willow bark tincture. The neighbor's wife, a broad-shouldered woman named Mrs. Call, arrived within the hour with tincture and dried elderberry, and a brisk, competent manner that made Hazel feel, for the first time in weeks, that she wasn't entirely alone. Rosette didn't sleep either. She kept the stove going with a concentration that looked like prayer. She brought water when Hazel needed it, and didn't ask questions and didn't get in the way. And when Bertie woke up frightened in the night, Rosette lay down beside her on the kitchen floor, with a quilt pulled over them both, and talked to her in a low, steady voice about nothing in particular, until the little girl fell back asleep. By the evening of the second day, Ned's fever broke. It broke in the sudden, drenching way that fevers do, leaving him soaked and limp and bewildered. He opened his eyes and looked at Hazel and said, in a voice like a dry hinge, "I'm hungry." The relief that went through her was so physical it nearly buckled her knees. Leland came back at midnight, came through the kitchen door carrying road dust and cold air, and stopped when he saw Hazel at the table with her head in her hands. He looked at the extra quilts on the settle. He looked at the willow bark and the damp cloth on the counter. "Who?" he said. His voice was flat and very careful. "Ned," she said. He's all right." Fever broke at supper. Leland went upstairs. He was up there for a long time, long enough that Hazel had put her head down on her folded arms, and was somewhere in the middle of the kind of half-sleep that isn't quite sleep when she heard his boots on the stairs. He came to the kitchen doorway. He stood there a moment. "You didn't send for me," he said. "There was no way to reach you that wouldn't have taken longer than dealing with it myself." He looked at her. She was too tired to read his face properly. She was too tired for most things. He crossed to the stove. He found the kettle still warm and poured a cup, and then he came back and set it on the table in front of her without a word. He sat down in the chair across from her, the same chair she had put his coffee in front of 3 weeks ago in the dark. "Rosette told me," he said. "She said you didn't leave his room, that you were there the whole 2 nights. There wasn't anywhere else to be." He was quiet for a moment. "She said you kept her steady." "She kept herself steady," Hazel said. "She's a good girl, Leland. A serious girl. She just hasn't had anything to be serious toward." Something moved through his face that she couldn't name. He looked down at his hands on the table. They were large and calloused and still faintly grimy with road dirt he hadn't had time to wash off. He didn't look like a man who was going to say thank you. He looked like a man who had been carrying something too heavy for too long and had just realized the weight had shifted. "I didn't choose this well," he said quietly. "The arrangement, I didn't ask you what you were walking into. I should have." "No," Hazel said. "You should have. But I don't think either of us had a great deal of choice." He looked up at her. "I'm going to fix the back bedroom," he said. The good one. It's warmer. You shouldn't be in that back room when it gets to deep winter. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't a declaration of. It was a man deciding to do a specific thing in a specific way, and in its own plain manner it said more than a speech would have. All right, she said. She drank the coffee. It was too hot and slightly bitter, and she thought it was one of the better things she'd ever tasted. Parch came in sideways on a cold, wet wind, and then, without much ceremony, turned into something that deserved to be called spring. The mud was extraordinary. It sucked at boots and wagon wheels and seemed personally offended by any attempt to cross it. The tall grass that had been flattened brown all winter began pushing up again, green and thin, and the sky lost some of its low iron weight and went somewhere in the direction of blue. Hazel had learned by March what it meant to be in a house rather than just occupying one. She had learned that Ned woke from bad dreams and would only settle back down if someone sat at the foot of his bed and didn't try to talk. She had learned that Rosette's silences were different from each other. Some were protective, some were thinking, some were the particular silence of a child who wants to say something and hasn't figured out if it's safe. She had learned that Bertie's offerings were deliberate and meant something, that the ribbon had meant she'd decided Hazel was staying, and the corn kernel had meant she was hungry and didn't want to ask. She had learned that Leland Mast's jaw unclenched slightly when he was working with his hands and not his head. She had learned that he sometimes stood in the kitchen doorway watching his children eat and had the expression of a man looking at something he was afraid to be grateful for, in case the gratitude called attention to itself, and something came to take it. She did not let herself think too hard about what she felt when he was near. She had enough to manage. But in the last week of March, something shifted. It was an ordinary evening. Supper was done, the children were asleep, and Hazel was sitting at the kitchen table with the household accounts spread out in front of her. She'd taken over the bookkeeping in January because she'd found the ledger 3 months behind and full of arithmetic errors that had been costing him money in small, consistent amounts. She had a pen and an ink bottle and a piece of paper she was using to calculate what the spring planting would run against what they had in the supply fund. Leland came in from the barn. He washed his hands at the basin. He came and sat down across from her at the table, which he did not usually do in the evenings. He looked at the ledger. "How bad?" he said. "Not bad," she said. "You're better off than I thought in October." The wheat price held. He nodded. He didn't move to go upstairs. She kept working. He sat. The stove ticked. After a while he said, "You don't have to do that, I know," she said. "But you've been making the same error in your grain column since September." A pause. What error? She turned the ledger toward him and pointed. He leaned forward to look. She was aware suddenly and with great precision of how close he was on the other side of the table. He smelled of hay and cold air and the particular soap he used, something plain and without character that had somehow, over 5 months, become a smell she associated with a specific kind of steady. He looked at the error. He was quiet for a moment. "I have been doing that wrong for 3 years, he said. "I know. It's in all the old ledgers." He sat back. He looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not the assessing look of the first day, not the closed-off grief of the winter. Something more direct than either. "Hazel," she looked up. "What your father did," he said carefully. "The arrangement. I want you to know I'm going to fix it." She set her pen down. "Fix it how?" "Legally," he said. "Properly, when you're ready. Not because you're owed something, though you are, but because you should have a name on this place that means something. A real name, not a housekeeper." She looked at him across the table and the stove and the 5 months between them. "That's a large thing to say," she said. "I know it is." He held her look. "I've been thinking about it since November." She was quiet for a long moment. She thought about the number on the paper in her father's coat pocket. She thought about the word housekeeper written in a ledger somewhere next to her name. She thought about Bertie's ribbon and Rosette's face in the doorway during the worst night of the fever, and the coffee she'd made at midnight for a man who was drowning in a dry kitchen. "I want it understood," she said, "that I'm not agreeing to something. Not tonight. Tonight. I am finishing these accounts." The corner of his mouth moved. It was a very small movement. She realized, never seen it before. Understood, he said. He stood up. He went to the stove and banked the coals for the night. He did it the way she'd shown him to do it in January, the right way, not the way that left the fire too low by morning. Then he straightened up and looked at her over his shoulder. The ledger error, he said. In the grain column. What about it? Show me how to fix it right, so I don't keep doing it. She looked at him for a moment. Sit back down then, she said. He did. They were at the table until nearly midnight. She showed him the column. He showed her what he'd been thinking. She corrected 2 more errors she'd found in the autumn accounts and explained her reasoning. He argued with her about one of them, and she had to concede, partially correct. She made a note in the margin. When they finally pushed back from the table, the house was very quiet and very still, and the lamp had burned down low. He said good night. She said good night. She sat alone for a moment, after his boots went up the stairs, listening to the spring wind against the windows. It was softer than the winter wind. It didn't push as hard. She thought that $112 was a very small number for a very large thing, and that life had a way of making those 2 quantities stop mattering to each other eventually, if you gave it enough time and enough hard work and enough midnight coffee and enough willingness to stay. She closed the ledger. She turned down the lamp. She went to bed in the good bedroom, the warm one, and she slept without dreams for the first time since October. In the morning, Bertie was waiting at the bottom of the stairs when Hazel came down. The child held up one hand, open-palmed. Sitting in the center of it was a small, smooth stone, pale gray and round, the kind the creek turned out by the hundreds. Hazel crouched down and looked at it seriously. That's a good one, she said. Bertie placed it in her hand and went to the kitchen without another word. Hazel closed her fingers around it. She could hear Leland already at the pump outside, the creak and pour of it, and Rosette's voice upstairs telling Ned for the second time to put his boots on, and the stove already going because she'd banked it right the night before. She stood up straight. She went to make coffee.